So welcome to the COVID-19 series of LBS Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. Today we are pleased and honored to host Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas. Pierre-Olivier is Professor of Global Economics at the Haas School of Management in the Department of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley, currently on sabbatical at Princeton University, although my understanding is he's joining us from South France. Now, before I pass the floor to Pierre-Olivier, let me just briefly state that Pierre-Olivier is one of the most prolific scholars in international finance and macroeconomics, having done path-breaking contributions on global imbalances, on dominant currency paradigm, on international finance. Alongside our London Business School colleague Hélène Ray, they were among the very first to alert the world community about global imbalances, which preceded the world financial crisis of 2007-2010. In more recent times, he has been working not only together with Hélène, but also with Gita Gopinath, the current chief economist of the IMF, on the role of the dollar and the euro. And he has also done very important work on the financial architecture of the Eurozone. Now, Pierre-Olivier, over the past couple of weeks, has been very busy first alerting the international community of the implications of COVID-19 for frontier economies, low-income countries in Africa and elsewhere, and also in emerging markets. And even more recently, they have put up a very interesting proposal for the G20 to think about the moratorium on debt interest payments. So without further notice, I will pass the floor to Pierre-Olivier, thanking you again, Pierre-Olivier, for taking the time. We are all aware how busy you are. I suggest that before you tell us the details of the proposal you have put forward with your colleagues, why don't you give us an overview of what are the challenges of the world economy nowadays, with an emphasis on emerging markets and low-income countries and frontier economies. And thank you again.
Well, Elias, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this very kind introduction. You have me blushing here. Let me start by, as you suggested, by taking a step back and thinking about where we are in terms of the global economy in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the first observation I think I want to emphasize is the fact that the pandemic is global. It's affecting a large number of countries. It's expected to affect all of them. It's present in pretty much every country in the world. And that means that every country in the world, whether it's a poor country like Cameroon, whether it's a middle-income country or emerging market economy like Mexico, whether it's a rich country like Sweden or the US or the UK, all of them have to deal with that. And there are very serious healthcare costs that are associated with dealing with the pandemic in terms of ramping up the healthcare capacity of various countries in the world. And then there are also the associated costs in supporting the economy, since, you know, pretty much the go-to policy at this point everywhere in the world is to have confinement orders, to ask people to stay home, distance themselves, shut down businesses. And that it inflicts a tremendous cost on the economy in the short term, and that requires some level of support from public authorities, from fiscal authorities. And now, if you take this broad perspective into account, and you think about the way the rich countries have been dealing with this, they've been very aggressively responding by putting together packages, fiscal packages, that are in the trillions of dollars, trillions of euros, very, very large fiscal plans. And most of these plans, whether it's the US or it's Italy or France or the UK, are going to be financed by debt. And so these countries are already going on the market, going to the market, the bond market, in a very big way. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how is this affecting the emerging countries and the low-income countries of the world, in particular the emerging market economies? In other words, those that also rely on the market to some extent to fund some of their government spending. And immediately you realize, well, that, you know, not everyone can be borrowing at the same time. If the rich countries of the world are going and tapping the market in huge amounts, then that is going to have to come from somewhere else. And so there is a danger that, you know, the countries that are fiscally safe, the United States, the Eurozone countries, Japan, other rich countries that are very, very safe, will look like attractive investment opportunities for people who want to, you know, park their money while the world is in crisis. And so that money is going to come in part from emerging market economies. It's going to come from the rest of the world. And so what we're facing is a situation where the rest of the world, the middle income, low income countries, are facing huge fiscal needs. They also need to address the fiscal crisis, but their access to the market is going to be very severely constrained. And so that's the context within which me and a group of other people sat down and thought, okay, well, we need to think about ways in which the other countries in the world, the Mexicos and the Cameroons, will be able to get the fiscal space that they need, given that the market is not going to provide it.
Thanks, Pierre-Olivier. And just a clarifying question, and this would apply even if emerging markets like Mexico or Turkey or India and Pakistan would not have been directly affected by COVID-19, which we know that they will.
Well, it would probably would have. I mean, if it had been somehow a virus that could target only the rich countries, or something that would somehow leave those countries, those middle and low income countries, unharmed, it would still have raised the sort of the borrowing needs from the advanced economies, and it would have put fiscal strains on the rest of the world. But you have that, and on top of it, you have also the same healthcare needs and needs to support the economy in those countries as well. Now, to this, I would add actually one other thing, which makes it even worse for many emerging market economies, which is that the global slowdown in economic activity, that global recession we're experiencing, it has one dramatic effect, which is that it crashed commodity prices as well. Now we see it most dramatically with the price of oil that turned negative a few days ago. That's sort of a little bit of a quirk, but so let's not focus on that too much. But commodity prices have declined dramatically, and a lot of these countries are commodity exporters, so their source of revenues is also drying up precisely at a time when they have very important needs.
So why don't you go now into more detail on your proposal with Pat Bolton, Li Buhait, Ugo Panessa, Chang Tai-Shi, Beatrice Mauro Di Vedder, and Mitu Gulati. It's an interesting mix of top lawyers, top international macroeconomists, the president of the CPR, and also finance professionals. So it's a very interesting mix, because what it's really important nowadays is that we bring resources across disciplines. So, for example, Li Buhait, for our viewers, was the key lawyer that dealt with the Greek debt restructuring, which so far has been the largest in the world.
Right. So I think, I mean, there was you know, given the situation I just described a few minutes ago, very clearly one of the ways in which emerging market economies, low and middle income countries, could get some relief is if somehow there is a way to suspend temporarily the payments they have to make to external creditors. And that's something that's already started. I mean, the IMF has in place, as a facility in place that is 25 countries are already eligible, that provides some debt relief to the debt that is owed to the IMF by very poor countries. In addition to that, the G20 about 10 days ago announced that they would also support a suspension of payments for bilateral official lending, so lending from country to country, not private lending. And so this all goes in the same direction. Everyone realizes this. But when you look at the numbers, and in particular for the emerging countries, this is also true to some extent even for the poorer countries, it's very hard to see how you can generate enough relief by just suspending payments to bilateral official creditors. You need to involve the private sector, because otherwise what happens? Well, you know, you suspend a payment that you owe to, let's say, Germany. That payment is going to in turn go and pay back some private creditor in a hedge fund in Greenwich, Connecticut. And it's providing some relief, but it's certainly not sufficient. So the big question was, how do we get the private sector involved? And it's the thorniest question when you think about any issue of sovereign debt payments and suspension of payments, etc., is how do we get the private sector to sit at the table and agree to delaying repayments in a way that is not going to lead to complete unraveling of the debt markets. And so that's in that context that, both Cheng Taishe, who is a professor at Booth, and myself have been thinking about this on the one hand, and Ugo Penita, who is an expert on international external debt problems, and Patrick Bolton, who is a very famous contract theorist with a lot of expertise in sovereign debt as well. We started talking, and then we decided we couldn't just think about this on our own as economists. We needed to engage with legal scholars, people who had actual experience with debt restructuring and debt standstills. And we reached out to Lee Buchheit and Mitu Gulati, who had been thinking very much along the same lines at about the same time. So there was really a convergence of views. And the question was, well, how do we make this happen? And so the basic idea behind the proposal we put together, which is actually out now as a policy insight on the CEPR website, was to say, well, let's try to have a carrot and a stick. And what is the carrot? Well, the carrot is we could say, well, look, if you're a private creditor, and let's say Cameroon owes you some interest payments on the debt they have contracted with you, instead of paying you back, they could put the money into a facility that would be monitored by either the World Bank or the African Development Bank in that case. And that money would be recycled back to the country to help fund expenses that are related to fighting the COVID-19 pandemic in that country. So whether it's direct healthcare expenditures or whether it's associated expenditures that have to do with supporting the economy, there would be sort of some set of guidelines on what is eligible, and then that money would flow back. So it's as if that money has not been paid to the creditor, but the creditor instead has a claim on this facility that has been put in place by the World Bank or the Regional Development Bank. So that's a way to suspend and recycle the interest payments for a while. Now, why would the creditors agree to that? Well, the creditors would agree to that maybe for a couple of reasons. First, the cost of this postponement of interest payments is relatively small for them. So at the end of the day, it's not really making an enormous difference on the interest payment part. They get quite a bit of goodwill. And they also, because it's channeled through the World Bank or a regional development bank, it gets sort of a preferred creditor status associated with that. So those claims are somehow secured from the point of view of the initial lender. So that's one part of it. Now, at the same time, you need also to suspend the principal repayments. Whatever principal is due during the same period, if we say we suspend everything for 2020, all the principal repayments also have to be suspended, because otherwise the same logic applies. You suspend interest payments, but you still owe the principal, then the relief is just not sufficient. So that takes care of, that generates a much larger envelope of resources that those countries can then use to fight the pandemic. Now you might say, well, why at the end of the day, why would all the creditors agree to that? Why would some of them not decide to hold out, which is this usual problem that maybe some investors have an interest in trying to get full repayment immediately, as opposed to engaging in a cooperative or a cooperative agreement. Well, that's where the stick comes in. And the stick here comes from the discussions we had with Lee Buchheit and Mitu Gulati, and realizing that there is this almost never used doctrine in international law that's called the doctrine of necessity. And what does the doctrine of necessity say? Well, the way, as economists, the way we think about it, it's almost like a way of completing markets. It's saying the following thing: well, there are things we can't possibly envision that might happen at some point. Things like a pandemic, or maybe, I don't know, being hit by a tsunami or something like that, something that is a sufficiently rare event. And we don't have really probabilities on whether this might happen or not. So it's just impossible to write it in the original contract. But we all understand that if something like that happens, then the priority for the sovereign will be to take care of their own citizens, and they will not be able to engage in repayment of external debt contracts. And the doctrine of necessity recognizes this and says, well, this is okay. You can suspend the payments. And if the payments are suspended, they will resume after. They will be tacked on the back end if you want. But, right now, the country is unable to do that. Now, the tension here is, of course, every borrower in the world at any point in time would want to claim that the doctrine of necessity applies. And that can't be right? So it has to be something that's sufficiently unusual, extraordinary, happens once in a century, that you could reasonably say, well, yes, the doctrine of necessity applies. In French, we would say force majeure. Well, the pandemic meets all this criteria, right? It's no fault of the countries. They have not put themselves in a situation where we're going to be exposed to this virus. It's totally exogenous for them. So there's nothing to do with moral hazard or other things. And it's totally infrequent. I mean, we had one maybe a century ago that was about as bad as this, and there's this one now. So from a legal point of view, there is sort of an opening there where the courts, and here what's important is that we're talking about the courts in New York or the courts in the UK, could decide that there is basis in that doctrine. And if they decide that, they automatically rule out any claim for repayment that would be coming from holdout creditors. So that's the stick. Why don't you engage in this facility, have the suspended interest and the principal deferred, and you build the goodwill and the net present value is relatively small. While on the other hand, you face the risk that all these claims could be sort of thrown out for a while, but you have no control over the process. So that's sort of the spirit of the proposal we've put together.
Yeah, so as a Greek citizen, those issues were very topical for my country a couple of years ago. So actually, I'm very sympathetic to this great proposal. Now, let me try to move a bit our discussion, because in parallel to your proposal and something that you mentioned in a couple of very interesting articles with Chang and your other co-authors at Project Syndicate and at Vox EU, where effectively you nicely coined it like a default bond. And we have seen something like 100, correct me because I don't follow every day the number of countries that have already sought some form of assistance from the IMF. One could add here the swap lines of many central banks with the Fed that have expanded in the past days or weeks. So how do you think these things will evolve, especially because it happens at a time when there were discussions that actually were one of the leading forces there on the reforming of the IMF and more generally the international financial architecture?
Well, that's a very important part of the equation. I mean, if I take the IMF, let me put things in perspective in terms of, by providing some numbers, so we have some idea about the scale of things we're talking about. So the IMF itself considers that the gross financing needs of middle and low income countries are on the order of $2.5 trillion across all the countries, adding things up. Our own view is that this is probably on the low side, but let's take that number as a number to work with. The fund itself has about $1 trillion in resources, and given all the different funding sources that it has. I mean, it has, of course, resources from its quotas, and it has also resources from borrowing agreements with a group of countries, multilateral and bilateral. And so you put all these things together, and you come up with close to $1 trillion. So it's quite significant, but it's not enough. It's not enough by far. The standstill that we're proposing with this in this Bolton Committee group, we named it the Bolton Committee because we felt that Patrick was an intellectual leader in that enterprise. Is basically we come up with numbers. Now we have to make some assumptions. We don't have all the granular data to figure out that, but back of the envelope, we come up with a number that's close to 800 billion. That's the amount of resources that would flow back to the middle and low income countries that would have been paid otherwise in interest and principal repayments and short-term debt that somehow would be available. So we're closing with what we're proposing, something that is quite significant. As an order of magnitude, we're talking about 4.5% of these countries' GDP overall. So that's quite significant. So it's get us there. But you're absolutely right. It's only part of a broader effort to sort of ramp up the resources that are available. So on the fund side, they've put in place and expanded a facility that is called the Catastrophic Containment Relief Trust, which provides immediate relief to very, very poor countries. But this is only for borrowing from the fund, and that is a relatively small amount in the overall scale of things that need to be done. The scaling up of resources of the fund is something that is running into the usual difficulties. There were discussions, for instance, of having a special drawing rights issuance, which means that the fund basically been collecting currency from the member countries and then be able to recycle that to other countries. This helps. This definitely would help. It's been done in 2009. It could help again. It runs into political opposition, in particular from the US. And it's also, one has to realize it's not a perfect instrument. It sort of doesn't get the liquidity where it needs to go. The Fed, you alluded to the swap facilities from the Federal Reserve. That's been very important. And here the Fed has done something more than just the swap lines. They've introduced what is called a FEMA, which is a repo facility. In other words, the Fed has two instruments. It can enter an agreement with another central bank in which they provide dollars in exchange for, let's say, pesos or some other currency. That can help, but the set of counterparties they work with is relatively small. And those are, from the perspective of the Fed, these have to be sort of very trusted counterparties. So it's a relatively limited number of institutions. But what they've done instead, they've said, okay, well, a lot of countries out there hold reserves, mostly US treasuries. And these US treasuries are useful, but these countries need cash right now. They need dollars. So we're going to let them deposit their treasuries and we're going to give them dollars in exchange on a temporary basis. That's the repo facility. And that is a much bigger set of counterparties. So that allows the dollar flows to reach into, you know, broader corners of the global markets. That's certainly going to be helpful. But at the end of the day, all of these things, even when you put them all together, they're not sufficient. So this is why our proposal is sort of an addition to that body of efforts to increase the firepower, if you want, of the financial institutions.
Great, you put it very eloquently. So, you know, the IMF or the Fed, more generally, or central banks, you know, we now, many emerging markets and frontier economies go to them for assistance, but, you know, for most citizens of this world, there is very low trust in general to institutions, not to say to the IMF or central banks. And, you know, to some extent, you know, people's views are right. We should not be dismissive. In the past, IMF program was a synonym of draconian austerity. So how do you see the role of the IMF assisting those countries? But is it austerity that you mentioned Cameroon earlier, what it needs, or Mexico, or perhaps Turkey?
Well, I think there is some monitoring might be needed, but maybe of a different nature than the standard conditionality that was applied. What do I have in mind? Well, I think that one has to be careful that, you know, many countries in the world may not have the institutional capacity and the level of institutional development that would guarantee that if an envelope of you know, X billion dollars or so many hundreds of millions of dollars be released, that it go to the right place. And when I say the right place, I mean by this that it would actually be devoted to funding the healthcare costs of the pandemic and the associated economic cost of supporting the local economy, the workers, the businesses, the financial sector. You have to be you have to be realistic about this. You have to realize that, you know, it's not a given that money will flow in the right place. That's actually why in what we have proposed, this credit facility where the countries would deposit, I was using the example of Cameroon, deposit, and, you know, nothing specific about Cameroon, it's just an example, but the interest would be deposited in this credit facility monitored by the African Development Bank or the World Bank, and it would be dispersed for specific uses, and there would be some degree of control. So that's the extent of the conditionality that we think needs to be put in place. But I don't think anyone at this stage is sort of saying, well, in exchange for these funds that you get in order to fight the pandemic, you need to put in place a stabilization program that's going to raise revenues, tax revenues, is going to cut government expenditures, is going to privatize some functions of the government, and all the things that sometimes would have been included in stabilization programs. So I think there is a change of focus here. Everyone realizes, and that's a sense in which this is very much an external shock, that this is not related to policy decisions that were taken by countries, and therefore that would need to be corrected. Instead, what we have is a situation where there needs to be support. That support needs to go to the right place. That's the key thing. It needs to get to the healthcare expenditures, it needs to get to programs that support workers, and not be divested into various ways and then disappear in the ether or find its way to some tax heaven somewhere. That's the worry, right? So here's where the monitoring needs to come in. But beyond that, there is absolutely no sense that this should be tied to future consolidation plans on the fiscal side. And I don't think we've heard anything in that direction coming from the financial institutions at this place.
Yeah, and if I was to add here, I think perhaps this will also help the popularity of those international institutions, or it will allow them to a bit restore the trust of people. For example, during the peak of the Greek crisis with Dimitri Vagianos from LSE, we were writing a couple of pieces arguing that the need to specific projects, actually having hospitals as a specific example at the time, so that people can see that there is some support going to them rather than a complex financial transaction involving banks, the fund, or in the case of Greece, the ECBs. I think this could be a very good proposal, thinking about it also more in medium to long term for the IMF and the World Bank.
I would add to that, I mean, this is stepping outside my area of expertise, but if I were to venture for a minute or so, I would say that, there's another aspect of this where I think the sort of the global response can be perceived as very, very positive for low and middle income countries. And here, the key thing is that the timing on the health side is slightly different across countries. And to some extent, a lot of emerging and developing countries have not yet been hit and are not yet had the peak of what we think might be coming, while a number of advanced economies, some European, not yet the US, but other advanced economies, have reached the peak and are on the other side. And so and that means something very important. That means that very quickly in the coming weeks and months, there's going to be spare capacity. The parts of Italy that were clamoring for more ventilators and more ICU beds and technical staff that knows, nurses and doctors that know how to deal with this, very soon there will be an excess capacity. And that excess capacity could be recycled to help in other parts of the world. So think about some sort of COVID international health brigade. That's not the IMF, that's not the World Bank, it's the WHO, it's the World Health Organization. But I think there's a tremendous role for the global community to actually reorient the resources so that, we can deploy them where they're needed. And if they're not needed, if you have spare beds and spare ventilators in Germany or in France, that they find their way to Nigeria or to India or Mexico.
Yeah, that's another great idea. So let me conclude our discussion with, so there's always the question what governments can do, which is a first obvious question. And here I refer to the governments of Mexico, of Ghana, of South Africa, actually, that we have been doing a lot of work at the Wheeler Institute, for example. And then a second question which I want to pose to you is that at the Wheeler Institute, actually, there was part of the vision of our donors, Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Lonely Planet, that we can think, especially thinking about Africa or frontier economies, of business. Typically, it was perceived either as part of the problem or irrelevant to the solution. Is there a way that the businesses can have a role, and we can distinguish, I guess, multinationals from local businesses, or in the case of your proposal, big financial institutions?
Well, these are broad questions. So let me start with the policy side. So what can the governments do in emerging and developing countries? And here I think not surprisingly, what I would say is maybe one of the first things they ought to do is to open talks with their regional development bank or the World Bank to set up one of those credit facilities so that they're ready to. It doesn't mean that they need to. Some countries may not need to at all. Some countries are still going to the market and are finding market access. So not everyone is facing the same situation here. But for those countries that really are facing pressing needs and find themselves really in a very tight spot in terms of their public balance sheet, of opening up this discussion and moving forward so that this can be in place and this can be activated quickly. I think that makes a lot of sense in my view. The second point I want to make is the danger there is that there's been tremendous progress in capacity building and institutions in many of these countries in the way they are running their fiscal and monetary policy and the way in which they're building buffers to handle external shocks. And there has been tremendous progress. There's been tremendous progress going back more than 10 years. I mean, in fact, the emerging economies, as we've seen, had a milder global financial crisis, in part because they had been already evolving and building some of that capacity. There is a danger that the situation is going to become so acute that we're going to unravel this. And you know, we might fall back into temptation to monetize debt, or temptation to run the printing press, or impose controls left and right, and those can set these countries back quite a long time after this pandemic. I mean, if you know, even if the pandemic is not maybe a couple of months, maybe it's going to be a year or 2 years. The hope is eventually we'll have a vaccine. The hope is eventually we'll have, you know, found a way to not be susceptible. But the question is, can we do things to our economy now that are going to take longer than that to recover from? And so I think it's important to keep in mind a little bit of the long run here for some of these countries. Now, it's difficult. I realize it's difficult because the situation can be suppressing, but this is where additional relief can be so important in avoiding this sort of adverse trade-off. One of the areas in particular where I think we haven't talked about is, you know, but that gets to the second point you were mentioning, is the question of private sector borrowers. Now, when I look at the data, I said, you know, there's about $800 billion in relief that would be coming from debt that is owed by the official sector to either private or official lenders. But there is an equal amount that is owed by the private borrowers to typically private creditors. And so that's very sizable as well. And you could imagine that a lot of these you know, local borrowers that are borrowing through their banks, or the banks themselves are borrowing on international markets, a lot of them are going to face tremendous amount of strain in honoring their debt obligations and the contractual obligations. And so what you're going to have to think about here is a way to provide some relief on that side as well. And so I think there is a role for government in that direction. That also means that on the side of the businesses, now we could look at many different businesses, but we can look at the financial institutions in particular. I think the financial institutions in the world right now, the private that sort of are channeling the funds towards these countries, whether private sector or official sector, I would urge them to really think about engaging in sort of a very valuable investment. I mean, in a sense, the relief that is provided now can be very, very instrumental in getting those countries back on their feet very quickly with very high return. And of course, we understand the coordination issue, but I think, you know, one message would be, this is not the time to play games. This is the time to really engage. And many of these financial institutions in the advanced world are right now backstopped by their central bank and by their government. They are getting the relief they need for the exposure they have in advanced economies. And in some sense, why don't they use some of that backstop they have to also provide a little bit of relief on the credits they owe on the credits they own on middle and low income countries? I think to me that's going to be critical. Multinational, in a sense, are playing a very similar role, because the multinational is a way to channel resources, you know, from the headquarters to affiliates in those other countries. And again, here I think there's a role to play to try to keep those affiliates alive, to try to keep some funding there, not to try to drain them to bring the resources to the headquarters. Again, you're going to get the relief you need from the Federal Reserve, from the Bank of England if you're located in the UK, from the ECB if you're in Europe, or from the treasuries in those different countries. So don't necessarily pull back the funding from the affiliates, because that's going to be needed. That's a long-term investment. So I think keeping some of that long-run investment perspective is going to be very important, especially when you realize you have other ways of buffering that shock if you're coming from the advanced economies.
Pierre-Olivier, thank you very, very much for taking the time. It was a very fascinating discussion, and we look forward to reading more about your work and how you clarify many of those issues. Let me just say to our viewers that over the next days, we will try to zoom on some specific emerging markets and frontier economies. For example, Turkey, Pakistan, India, and we're doing more work having experts discussing about the specific challenges of countries. So I look forward to meeting you in the future. Pierre-Olivier, thank you very, very much for taking the time. It was a real pleasure.
You're welcome, Elias. Thank you to you and your audience.
Thank you very much.